Hey, I'm Zach. I like to read fantasy, sci-fi, and horror, so if you like any of those things, stick around. These are my top 10 reads from 2023, a little bit belated, but this was a difficult list to put together. So I read about 63 books last year, which for me is a lot. And while I'm happy with the output, it made coming up with a top 10 list really difficult. I tend to pick books that I mostly really like, and there's so much subjectivity in these types of lists that sometimes it feels really difficult or even pointless, but nonetheless, it's fun to do. So here we go. A couple of honorable mentions because I could not get it down to 10. Yumi and the Nightmare Painter by Brandon Sanderson. This is the third Secret Project novel, and I really liked this one a lot. The magic system and the world building feel very Sanderson, so if you like his writing, you'll be right at home. But at the same time, there are some different inspirations you can feel him drawing from, such as certain types of anime tropes. There's kind of a sort of a romance between two characters and like a body swap element where they have to work together to figure out why they're kind of switching places. And that was really fun and kind of different. And that paired with some of the crazy magic systems that Sanderson uses made for a really fun read. The artwork in this thing is just phenomenal. I'm really impressed with the quality of the books Sanderson's team was able to put together so quickly as well. Yeah, this was fun. It didn't quite crack the top 10, but I don't know. It almost did. Come Closer by Sarah Gran is a really creepy short horror novella about a woman who starts to suspect maybe she's possessed. Weird things start to happen. There's a little bit of black humor in this, which is kind of funny, but overall, this is a pretty dark read. And you can get through it in like 2 hours. So just for that, I really liked it. The Saturday Night Ghost Club by Craig Davidson is another novella, another horror, kind of a horror literary novella. This is about a man who is remembering his childhood and some of the specific traumas and family secrets that he learned as a kid, and some of the dark secrets around the town he grew up in and how that was related to stuff that happened with his family. This is very much a coming-of-age story, so it's kind of a literary, much shorter version of something like It, where you have a young protagonist, a group of young friends, uncovering dark secrets and maybe something a little bit more spooky that happened at some point in the past. One of the things I liked about it is it looked at the role memories play in our perception of what happened in the past and how that changes as we grow older. So there were a few different layers to this book, and even though it's short, it will leave you thinking for a while. Final honorable mention, Eragon and Eldest, the first two books in the Inheritance cycle by Christopher Paolini. I loved these books when I was a teenager. They were like some of my favorite things. I reread Eragon probably 24 times when I was like 11 or 12. It's just the perfect mix of like dragon riders and kind of the plot from Star Wars and a magic system that's kind of like Wizard of Earthsea. It's really like a naming-based system with like an ancient language that allows you to control things. It has a young protagonist who is kind of the shoo-in for any teenage boy who kind of want the power fantasy, but also love this genre. And I mean that in a charming way. And I think this is charming. I was a little bit worried going back to this as an adult that these books weren't going to hold up very well and that I'd be really disappointed. I'm happy to say I still really enjoyed these. And granted, I'm biased. I have a lot of nostalgia for these books. But there's other books I've gone back and reread that haven't held up as well. And I think these hold up pretty well. I think I'm really shocked by how good of a writer Christopher Paolini was at such a young age. Like, his prose is really good. His narrative structure is good. Granted, he's using a lot of familiar beats like the hero's journey, but he does a good job with scenes and characters and tension and dialogue, much more so than you'd expect for someone in their late teens or even early 20s. And I think these stories kind of come into their own a little bit as the series goes on. There are moments where it feels like it drags a little bit here or there, but overall, I think he does a good job of establishing himself as a writer. And if you like classic fantasy, if you like dragon rider stuff, or ancient languages that give you power over magic, if you like the plot to Star Wars, the wise old mentor, and the evil empire, this has all of those things in a way that is just a lot of fun to read. And so, yeah, it's not breaking a ton of new ground, and that's fine. That's not what I read it for. But I'm really happy with this. And so right now I'm reading through the last book in the series so that I can get to Murtagh, which is on my shelf, which came out end of last year. So I'm excited to get to that because I think Paolini's grown as an author. But yeah, those books are fun. Okay, so those are all my honorable mentions. Let's get into my top 10 reads of 2023. In the number 10 place, I have The Twisted Ones by T. Kingfisher. This is a horror book about a woman who goes by the name Mouse. Her grandmother passes away. She has to go and take care of her grandmother's house and all her stuff, which is way out in the middle of nowhere, a house in the woods. And when she gets there, it turns out her grandmother was a hoarder. And so the house is a disaster. This isn't going to be a 1 or 2 day job. She's going to have to stay here for at least a couple of weeks to get things sorted out. As she stays here and starts to go through her grandmother's things, weird things start to happen in the woods around the cabin, spooky things. While she's cleaning out her grandmother's house, she finds the journal of her step-grandfather, who went mad and died a long time ago. As she goes through his journal, she starts to realize the things that were driving him mad, the crazy things that were happening, are some of the things that are starting to happen in the woods while she's there. Needless to say, very creepy. I really liked some of the horror and fantasy elements that T. Kingfisher used that were happening out in the woods. Like, I thought that was a lot of fun. Horror books sometimes fizzle out by the end, but I liked the ending of this one. It went in a direction that I just thought was satisfying. But perhaps even more importantly, the main character, her and her loyal dog, were such likable characters that I really just was worried about what was going to happen to both of them. And some of the side characters they met in the small town that they're staying in were also really endearing. So anyway, if you want a nice horror read with kind of a dark fantasy element to it, this was great. Number 9, My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. This is a literary historical fiction book, which is not my usual genre, but I love this. This is the story of 2 young girls growing up in kind of a post-World War II Italy, and it really looks at how their friendship evolves as they, as people, grow up and evolve in a kind of post-war climate where the socioeconomic factors and the fallout from the war have put a lot of strain on the family units. And so they deal with a lot of trauma and issues just in their families and in the communities that they are raised in. And you see how this impacts them as people and how it impacts their friendship. This was beautifully written, and it's the first of 4 books, so I plan to read the remaining books throughout this year and next year. But this was really great. So even if that's not your normal genre, if it sounds interesting at all to you, I highly recommend it. Number 8, Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This was the first secret project that he released last year. To be honest, it was a toss-up between this and Yumi and the Nightmare Painter about what I put on my list. I ended up going with this because it has Princess Bride vibes, which I love. But what really put it over the edge for me is just the world that this is set in is so fascinating. It has one of the coolest takes on like a pirate journey. Brandon Sanderson really did a great job with the world building that was just something that I had never really seen before, while using tropes I'm very familiar with, like Princess Bride going to rescue the princess while doing some inversion, whereas it's it is Tress, the young woman who is going to rescue the young man that she is fond of. So this is swashbuckling, it's fun, it ties into the wider Cosmere, but I also think it's a good starting place. So if you've read Brandon Sanderson and you like the Cosmere, you're going to love this. It connects in, you meet some characters, and there are some references that you'll really like. If you've never read Brandon Sanderson, that's okay. This is a really good place to start. They're great characters. It's a very contained story. And if you continue to read other things set within Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, you'll start to recognize some of the things that happened in this book and how they connect to his wider universe. Caliban's War by James S. A. Corey is the second book in the Expanse series. I really enjoyed this. I loved Leviathan Wakes. It was really fun. But I feel like Caliban's War really punched it up a little bit. It made me more connected to the characters. It also introduced a few additional characters I really like. So in the first book, we meet Holden and the crew of the Rocinante, and I like them a lot, especially Amos and Naomi. But in book 2, we meet Avasarala and Bobby Draper, and those 2 characters are both awesome as well. Avasarala is like this political sort of genius, but also she's not like the highest echelon. She's kind of like middle of the political sphere. And she's an older woman. She's sort of a sailor-mouthed grandmother swearing her way through the United Nations, trying to get things done. And she was pretty charming and very, very smart. And Bobby Draper was just a really tough Marine, but a well-done one. She wasn't just the tough girl, and that's like her whole personality. I thought she was well-rounded, was a really likable and interesting character, and her teaming up with Avasarala. Bobby Draper was one of the characters who's from the Martian side of the conflict, and Avasarala is from the United Nations, kind of the Earth side of the conflict. Them teaming up was a really interesting dynamic. This book really started to get into more of the complexity politically and between the different factions in the Expanse series. and it got me super excited for the rest of the series. So I'm now in book 4, but I feel like book 2 is where I really got invested, and I'm excited to continue it. All right, book 6, I'm going to cheat a little bit here because this is my video. I'm allowed to do that. Golden Sun and Morning Star by Pierce Brown, books 2 and 3 in the Red Rising series. I'm picking both of these because I just can't choose between them, and they're part of the same trilogy. The first book, Red Rising, I liked it, but I didn't love it. It was okay. The world was really interesting. There were some really cool concepts, but I didn't get super connected to the characters in the first book. I feel like that changed in Golden Sun, and this book greatly ratcheted up just the level of intensity and epicness of this series. And some of the twists along the way in this book were truly like Game of Thrones level, Jaw on the floor type things that happened. And so it was awesome. Morning Star, I liked just as much, even though it was a little bit slower and more meditative compared to Golden Sun. Still a very fast-paced book overall, but Morning Star was a great conclusion to the first trilogy in this series and had some really satisfying resolutions. This took me from just kind of being on Red Rising to really, really liking it. Number 5, The Black Tongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman. This is a high fantasy adventure that is kind of grimdark, kind of funny. Honestly, if you like Joe Abercrombie, the first Law series, or if you like Scott Lynch and The Gentleman Bastards, you're probably really going to like Black Tongue Thief because it's really funny. The characters are really well drawn. The banter and the dialogue is super sharp, super funny. I actually laughed out loud multiple times in this book, which is pretty rare for me. But it's also got some darkness to it. Like, this is not a happy tale. There's a lot of violence and just weird, dark things that happen. So if you like weird, dark fantasy, but you also like dark humor and really sharp banter, you should check this out. It was really imaginative. It was a surprise hit for me this past year. I can't wait for the next book in this series. I believe it's coming out this year, The Daughter's War, which is a prequel to this book, based on one of the characters in The Black Tongue Thief. So I'm super excited for the new book. If you haven't read Black Tongue Thief yet, absolutely check it out. It's super good. Wolves of the Kala by Stephen King. This is the 5th book in the Dark Tower series. I read this at the beginning of last year. I didn't end up finishing the series. I still need to finish the 7th book, The Dark Tower, which is, I have a feeling that book maybe would have been on this list instead. So I'll finish that this year. I really liked Wolves of the Kala, and I was worried because I've heard somewhat mixed things on this book. A lot of people love Wizard and Glass, and many people view it as the best book in the series. Wizard and Glass is probably still my favorite entry in the Dark Tower so far, but coming out of that book, I thought if book 5 is super slow, like a lot of people said, it's going to be such a slog to get through. I was really worried about it. I ended up having a great time. It was relatively slow, and I can see how if there were certain plot lines that happened in that book that you just really didn't care for, how it might be kind of boring, but I loved it. I loved the Roland and team visiting this small town and having to deal with this kind of Old West problem of like, we have these raiders that come in every once in a while and, steal some of our kids. And if we do anything to resist, they just massacre us. And so it's kind of the classic, the gunslinger has a shootout that's coming, at high noon. It's kind of the feeling that you get. But there's a lot of weird dark sci-fi elements that you get from the Dark Tower, such as the riders have these laser swords, and maybe they have they're wolves that ride these robotic horses. A lot of wacky stuff. It's Dark Tower, so Stephen King gets super weird, but that's part of what I loved about it. That's part of its charm. My 3rd favorite book this year is The Will of the Many by James Islington. This is the first book I've read by him. I've heard relatively good things about Licanius. It doesn't seem like it lands for everybody. But it seems like he has really creative ideas for plotting. I think that holds for this book. It's a Roman-inspired epic fantasy novel about a young fugitive who joins an elite academy that's kind of run sort of by the government to progress his status and abilities to try and achieve his revenge or his personal goals. So it has kind of that Red Rising element of someone in an elite society rising through this prestigious school who's, not supposed to be there and has to keep that a secret. That element is fun, adds a lot of tension, but the world this is set in is super interesting and the magic system is really neat. The masses contribute a portion of their willpower to power the elected officials. So those people leech off of them, and you can have a Septimus who has a bunch of will he gets from his subjects that makes him stronger, faster, just more powerful in general. So really interesting. And there were some twists along the way in this book that I really did not see coming. And I read a fair amount of fantasy. So if you want something that feels fresh and unique and goes directions you might not expect, this is a great pick for that. And I think book 2, The Might of the Few, I'm not sure if it comes out this year, but I think it comes out, if not this year, next year. It's coming soon. So super excited for that. Now is a great time to jump into it. Red Seas Under Red Skies by Scott Lynch. This is the second book in the Gentleman Bastards sequence. I read Lies of Locke Lamora like 10 years ago, and I loved it. I honestly don't know why it took me so long to read the second book, because this was just as good. There was more nautical elements, which I know not everybody's a fan of, but this is, when I went into it, I was a little bit worried that this was just a book out at sea with pirates, and it's not. There's a decent chunk of that here, and I don't mind some nautical fantasy, but I was worried this was just going to be all at sea for like 700 pages. A lot of this book is in more of a casino setting. The Sin Spire, this house of gambling and of wealth and influence. And they're conning their way through this really kind of affluent gambling hotspot while also having some pirate things that get tied in. And so it's both of these things at once, which was really interesting. As usual, Locke Lamora and Gene Tannen are a fantastic duo. And there are some other really fun characters in this book. The dialogue and the banter is hilarious and sharp as ever. I think Scott Lynch is one of the funniest and most eloquent fantasy authors working today. And I believe we're supposed to get some new Gentleman Bastards stuff this year. I think it's like 1 or 2 novellas, but there's more stuff coming, and I believe he's making progress on book 4, The Thorn of Emberlane, as well. So hopefully the long waiting period that fans of this series have had is coming to an end. I still have to get through book 3, which I'll be doing this year. Either way, even if we didn't get the next book, I think it's worth reading. It's that good. That being said, I can't wait for the next book. My favorite read of 2023 is The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. The Grace of Kings is an epic fantasy that feels historical and biblical, and it feels very real in some ways while being totally an epic fantasy book. I believe it was inspired by the Chu Han contention from Chinese history, at least for the first book. And so I think some of that inspiration makes this feel incredibly real, but it doesn't feel like a textbook. It doesn't feel like it's not fantasy. Like, it doesn't just feel like history. He adds a lot of fantastical elements to it. And then from there, he builds out his own kind of fantasy world. I've heard books 2 through 4 take that a lot further. One of the things I worry about when I read a very historical, like biblical style epic that has a huge cast of characters and is written from more of an omniscient viewpoint, and some people have not loved that aspect of it. I think what makes this work so well is that there are a lot of really likable characters that I still felt connected to. Even though the style was more zoomed out, normally that would be something that I don't love, and just the way Ken Liu did it, it felt like I really knew some of these characters deeply, while getting this huge sweep of history that was happening across all the different provinces and cities within this contentious period of this world. It was just awesome, super exciting, is one of the most epic things I've ever read. I really feel like this series is up there with A Song of Ice and Fire and Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time, Stormlight. Like, this is one of the great fantasy epics of our time. And it's kind of crazy to me. Like, it's complete. All 4 books are out. They came out, I think, over the past decade or so. It's not that this doesn't have any attention. Like, it's relatively well known within the fantasy genre, but I still think this deserves so much more attention than it's given. It's beautifully written, awesome characters, awesome plot, just epic things that happen. And by the end of the book, it's so satisfying, so interesting, and to some extent, it ends in a way that is sort of expected, while also taking a lot of turns you don't expect. So it satisfies you like you would hope, but in ways you didn't necessarily predict. And I've heard books 2 through 4 are even better, which seems crazy to me. So I'll absolutely be continuing this series later this year. So that's it. Those are my top 10 favorite books that I read in 2023. Have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? Leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts, or tell me your favorite read from last year. Thanks for watching. Relatively new channel, so if you like the types of stuff I'm reading, it'd be awesome if you drop me a follow, and I'll release some new reviews of books soon.